overlay this catarogrid structure on its particum structure over its particule equivalent, again we get serious mismatch between the structures. If we overlay them on their false centers, the 5 centers, none of the other centers align. And it doesn't matter what basis we pick for trying to align them, we won't get them to line up properly. So that means that, the structure isn't capable of forming alignments from one polarity level to the next, or from one level of cosmic structure to the next. Also, we see that the tree of life structure has a relationship to another pattern, as we see in this diagram here. We see a pattern behind the Metatronic tree of life. And this is a pattern that Ash describes as the bloom of doom. In the properly constituted catarogrid, the catarogrid is not a static structure, it's dynamic, it's moving, and in particular, there are patterns of energy flow within the catarogrid. We have the central seed atom, which forms an open doorway connection to source, and we have energy distribution patterns within the catarogrid. The operation of the root-shaped pattern within the catarogrid, it sets up a flow of energy from the center to the periphery. This flow of energy generates lotus arcs of energy running from the center, the central seed atom, out to the periphery. So there's a set of lotus arcs that distribute energy within the catarogrid, and these are dynamic. There's an outflow and a backflow return. And not only that, but these petals, they're not fixed in position. As the breeding pattern, as the breeding goes through its cycle, these lotus petals, they oscillate, they move, they oscillate out to their maximum extension, back to the center, out to maximum extension, and so on. So we have a lotus breeding pattern that distributes energy within the catarogrid and through the structures that are based on the catarogrid. Now, this space between the maximum expansion of the lotus petals is out to 45 degrees. The breeding pattern goes from the center out to 45 degrees and back again. Now, it's important that that this space here is important. This space in the breeding pattern is important because this is where the breeding pattern, this is the breeding pattern for the particum side, and the space here allows for the corresponding breeding pattern for the particase side to occur. So we have a similar set of lotus arcs corresponding to the particase side in the gaps here. And all of these must be aligned to allow for a synchronized breeding pattern between the particum and the particase side. So we have the two breeding patterns operating in synchronism, so that as one is breeding in, the other is breeding out. So we have synchronized breeding between the particum and the particase sides of creation. Now, a distortion that has arisen, and that Ash refers to as the bloom of doom, it derives from the sextant grid distortion. The sextant grid distortion takes this lotus breeding pattern. It locks the petals, instead of letting them run out to their 45-degree point of maximum expansion, it pulls them further out into 60 degrees of displacement from the center and locks them in that position, so that it holds them locked open in a particular alignment, and it traps a certain amount of energy, but it prevents the natural breeding pattern where there's an ebb in the flow, an outflow, and a backflow return. So it locks them open in a particular 60-degree alignment, and that's the alignment that's represented by this pattern here. This is the sextant grid distortion, represented by the lotus petal pattern being locked open in its 60-degree expansion. Now, furthermore, if we look at the sextant distortion of the lotus breeding pattern, we see that the lotus breeding pattern operates from the central seed atom, from the azure point at the center of the catarogrid. If we go to the tree of life structure, we see that the central seed atom is blocked off. There's no connection there. so this sextant losses distortion, or the sextant distortion, operates from a lot of other points within the tree of life structure. It operates from all the other centers and from a number of other points around the tree of life, but it doesn't operate from the critical center point. So it represents a grid work that takes a certain amount of energy out from source, locks it in position, and prevents it from flowing back. It disconnects from the center and doesn't allow a backflow return to occur. Now, we come back to our numbers. We looked at the Fibonacci numbers. The Fibonacci numbers are the basis for the Fibonacci spiral. The Fibonacci numbers are formed by adding the previous two numbers, starting with a number sequence 0 and 1, the simplest number sequence available, and adding each pair of numbers to get the next number. So the 2 is formed from the sum of the previous, of 1 and 1. The 3 is formed from adding 2 and 1, and so on. So when we add the numbers in pairs, we get a sequence of numbers that goes 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. So this builds up what's referred to as the Fibonacci number sequence. And the ratio, as we move further out along the sequence, the ratio between each number is 1.618 times the previous value. So the numbers fall into the golden mean ratio. Now we can see from this pattern that each number has connection to the previous two only. In other words, each number has relationship to the previous two only. Now, we can ask the question, what would happen if instead of adding 2 numbers, if we added 3 numbers, what pattern would we get? If we added 3 numbers, added the previous 3 numbers, we would get a slightly higher ratio between them, something like 1.8 something or other. And if we add more and more of the numbers, we get a number that approaches 2. Now, we can ask the question, what would we get if we added all of the previous numbers in the number sequence? Okay, so if we add all the numbers, starting out with the same sequence of numbers, 0 and 1, add all of them at each stage. Now, at this stage, we're adding 1 and 1 to get 2. And then if we add the 2 again, we get 2 plus 1 plus 1, we get 4. And then include the 4, and we get 8. And add all of these numbers here, we get 16, 32, 64, and so on. So we see once we add all of the numbers in our sequence, we come out with the crystal number sequence. Okay? So in the crystal number sequence, we get the primary number sequence from the crystal spiral. So within the crystal number sequence, every number is the sum of all of the previous numbers plus 1. Every number is the sum of all of the previous numbers in the crystal sequence plus 1 plus unity. And furthermore, the ratio between each of the numbers is 2. So they're all expanding by this crystal spiral ratio of 2. So we can see from this that the crystal spiral can be generated using addition as well as by multiplication. And this addition includes all of the earlier, or this inclusion of all of the earlier points is a key distinguishing feature for the crystal spiral. Now we have this, we have the crystal spiral number sequence here, but we also have this additional 1. And we can look now at what the significance of that 1 is. Okay, now we had mentioned earlier that a natural spiral expands outwards, but it's also capable of contracting inwards. Like that's key. That's also an element of spiral expansion, is that it's capable of expanding inwards. Now, in particular, a proper spiral is capable of continuing to expand inwards beyond its starting point into the center. So all natural spirals are capable of contracting inward towards the center in addition to expanding outwards. So what we have here is an interplay of 2 processes. Wherever we have expansion, we have contraction. So the expansion and the contraction are complementary aspects of the same underlying process. So for example, the multiplication of diversity as we expand out in creation is complemented by a corresponding division of unity. So expansion, multiplication of diversity and division of unity are complementary processes. So if we look at creation from the point of view of source, if we look at creation from source's perspective, what we see is unity being progressively divided into smaller units. We have the unity and the integrity of source breaking down into progressively smaller units. And looking at it from the other end, we see a multiplication of a large number of structures. In other words, we see the multiplication of all of the different creatures, the different beings, different planets, the different structures in creation. So these two are the two sides of the same coin. Now, if we, instead of expanding outwards, multiplying by 2, going from 1, 2, 4, 8, and so on, if we contract inwards, we do so by taking the 1, dividing it by 2 instead of multiplying. So we get a half, a quarter, an 8, a 16, to 32, a 32nd, and so on. So this takes us along an inward directed spiral that will ultimately contract all the way back into the center. If we add these points, they all add up to that 1 that we saw on the previous diagram, or sorry, in the previous sequence. So that unity, that extra 1 that we saw, is the sum of all of these terms in the inner spiral. So unity is the sum of all the numbers corresponding to the inner spiral all the way back into the center. Now, if we take this sequence and put in these numbers, we'd say this 128 is the sum of the outer terms of the crystal spiral plus the inner terms, a half, a quarter, an 8, a 16th, all the way back to source. Okay? So what this means then is that every number is the sum of all of the previous numbers, including the inner spiral, all the way back to the source. So this means that every point integrates and preserves the content of all of the previous points, and also that every point has a direct connection all the way back to the center, all the way back to source. So compare that with the Fibonacci spiral. Every term was just the sum of the previous two. Here, every term, what the numbers are telling us is that every term connects all the way back to the center, back to source in the center. And every point integrates has all of what has gone on, all of what has happened before it. Now, we've spoken about that in terms of the quadrant points. In other words, the 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, those points on the quadrant arms of the spiral. This property is true for every point on the crystal spiral, every point, not just the quadrant points. So, for example, I could take, you didn't worry too much about this point of detail, but it's, for anybody who's more into numbers, it's interesting to point out. Like, we can take this here, this relationship here, and we can multiply it by any number. We say I take 100. If I replace the 1 there, multiply both sides of that by 100. Replace all the 1s by 100. So 100 is equal to 100 over 2. 100 over 2 is simply the point that is 90 degrees earlier on the spiral. 100 over 4 is the point that's 90 degrees earlier than that on the spiral. So that means that every point on the spiral is the sum of all of the quadrant points preceding it. So that means that every point on the spiral connects all the way back to source, all the way back to 0, all the way back to source, and it integrates the content of the points through which they expanded to that point. So this is a very powerful feature, and it's unique to the crystal spiral. Now, okay, so we're going to digress a little bit here. We're going to go into a little bit of background science, as it were. This has value in that it helps us to come to terms with the integrity, the truth, the power, the strength of this information, the strength of these teachings, we begin to see how incredibly accurate, how incredibly powerful and profound these teachings are. Now, if we look at the spiral, look at the features of the spiral, a spiral combines two of the most fundamental processes in creation. It combines the process of growth with the process of oscillation. If we think of circular motion, if we take a weight on a string and spin it around, we create circular motion. So with circular motion, we have an arm that is spinning, rotating uniformly, but remaining the same length as it rotates. Now, if we compare that with the spiral, again, we have the rotation. We have an arm spinning around, but as it spins around, it's also increasing. So the spiral combines the rotation of the circle with the expansion, with the process of expansion, where the arms are getting bigger as they rotate, as they move further out. Sorry, as they rotate, they're becoming bigger, and the spiral is moving outwards. So the spiral combines the rotation of the circle with a process of growth or a process of expansion. So it combines two fundamental processes in creation, and this is the context in which we can speak of spirals of creation. Now, wherever we have circular motion, we have oscillation, we have vibration, we have frequency. So wherever we have frequency or oscillation, anything to do with frequency, that always goes back to circular motion at some level. And we can see a little bit of how that arises here. If we take a circle that's rotating, represented here, if we look at the arm that is generating the circle, and as it rotates, it casts a shadow on the vertical line. Now, as the circle, the arm rotates around the circle, the shadow moves up and down along the vertical axis. As it moves up and down, it creates a wave motion. This wave motion corresponds to oscillation or vibration, and it generates frequency. So rotation generates frequency, and wherever we have frequency, it can be traced back to rotation at some level. So this oscillation, this phenomenon of oscillation, is present in the spiral. Now, if we just look at the growth process on its own, there is a characteristic pattern for all growth processes in creation. We can speak in terms of growth and decay, or probably more accurately in terms of expansion and contraction. Now, growth processes, they have a common behavior, whether it's growth in nature, growth of trees, population growth, growth of money, whatever, economic growth or whatever. Growth takes place by a process of multiplication, just as we have like the expansion of the spiral. So, for example, if we take the growth of money, and like there are some very expert people here who are familiar with the growth of money. So if we take, we'd say $1,000, and we consider that we have a super efficient investment whereby that doubles every year, just for the sake of simplicity. So we start with $1,000. Well managed, that's it, John, yeah. We have a well-managed investment such that the $1,000 doubles every year. So after 1 year, we have $2,000. So that $2,000 continues growing. In the second year, it doubles again and becomes $4,000. In the third year, doubles again and becomes $8,000, and so on. So a key feature of these growth processes is that as the growth expands, it becomes faster. In other words, the rate of growth is proportional. The rate of growth is proportional to the state of growth. In other words, the more money you have, the faster it will grow. Yeah. Yeah. But the same thing is true of, we say, the population growth, the growth of the population on the planet. For example, it took a long time for the population to grow, we'd say, up to 1 billion people. It took a much shorter time. It got to a stage where we said there was 1 billion people. It took a shorter time to get to the 2nd billion. and a short time again to get to the third billion. So a characteristic of these growth processes is that as they grow, the rate of growth gets faster and faster. And this is referred to as exponential growth. And it all goes back to this process that we've seen, this cycle of expansion that we have seen present in the spiral, in these spirals. These spirals expand by progressive multiplication, and they exhibit this, this growth pattern. So these natural growth patterns, they go back to the very similar growth patterns that we see in these spirals, particularly in the crystal spiral. Now, the reverse process of growth is, or of expansion is contraction. So we also have a process of decay. Decay occurs in the opposite direction, where instead of expanding, we're going in the opposite direction. Things are contracting. Now, an example of a decaying process, we say, is if you take a cup of coffee, the cooling of a cup of coffee, where anything is reducing. Now, if you take the cooling of a cup of coffee, it starts off cooling fairly rapidly, and the cooler it gets, the slower it cools. So it follows an extension of this pattern in the opposite direction. So the more it decays, the slower the decay. But the same process applies to both expansion and contraction, to growth and decay. One is expansion is moving in the positive direction of positive numbers, whereas contraction or decay is moving in the opposite direction of negative numbers. Now, if we just go back to the numbers, as we mentioned earlier, numbers are extremely powerful, an extremely powerful aspect of creation. They hold a lot of consciousness. They have a very big story to tell. And if we can give them voice and listen to what they say, they can tell us quite a lot. Now, if we take, we can represent the ordinary numbers geometrically as being spread out along a line like a ruler. So if we take our ordinary counting numbers, we can spread them out in a line as we like on a ruler. Now, the negative numbers are important. They do play a role also. So they are significant, for example, when we have when we're in debt in the bank. We know all about negative numbers then. As we go further into debt, we go further into these negative numbers. Now, geometrically, we can get these negative numbers by taking the line that we have up there for the positive numbers, rotating it through 180 degrees, we get the negative numbers. We get the same effect by multiplying the negative number, sorry, the ordinary numbers by -1, and we get the negative numbers. So the combination of the positive and the negative numbers make up a collection of what is referred to as the real numbers. Now, we can ask, are there any other numbers of interest between the two, between the positive and the negative numbers? And it actually turns out that there's a very important sequence of numbers halfway between the two. So instead of rotating the set of numbers, the number line, fully through 180 degrees, if we rotate it through 90 degrees, we get a vertical sequence of numbers that turn out to be extremely important. Now, when we got the negative numbers by multiplying by -1, we can get these new numbers. Instead of multiplying by -1, we take a half step and we multiply by the square root of -1. So these numbers here represent numbers that are created by multiplying by the square root of -1. Now, this creates a particular it's a complexity. Some of you will have come across all of this in your high school math days and wanted to get as far away as possible from it. But there is a point of significance here that is worth revisiting, if you can just bear with us for a minute. So we have this set of numbers here that in 90-degree alignment with the ordinary numbers. They're associated with this square root of -1. That's how they're generated. Now, that creates a problem, because if we take our ordinary numbers and if we square them up, if we square a negative number, we will always get a positive number. In other words, if I multiply -1 by -1, I get +1. In other words, all numbers square up to a positive number. That means that means if I try to take the square root of a negative number, it doesn't correspond to any number here. So in ordinary mathematics, nobody knows where these numbers come from. They don't connect to these. Nobody knows where they come from, and they're called imaginary numbers because nobody knows where they come from, and that's where the I. That's why this symbol here is denoted by the letter I. The I means imaginary. But yet these are play an extremely powerful role in creation, and are being used. These numbers are used all the time, even though scientists and mathematicians and engineers and so on, they don't know where they come from. Now, if we look at the Partic-I, go back to the Partic-I phasing process, we can see where these numbers come from. So we have the Partic-I phasing process. The Partic-I phasing process creates two polarities, a Particum and a Partic-A, and these two polarities emerge in 90-degree alignment. That's what we have down here. We have our Particum numbers on the horizontal line, and the set of numbers at 90 degrees on this 90-degree axis, they correspond to a parallel set of numbers. They come from the Partic-A side of creation. So what we have here is the interplay of two parallel sets of numbers represented by the original Partic-I phasing process. So that's where the numbers are coming from. Now, we've seen that when we expand out along the, in the positive direction, we get a process of growth, of exponential growth out in this direction, or of decay or contraction in the negative direction. Now, if I apply this same process of repeatedly multiplying a base number along these new Partic-A numbers, what do we get? This is where something very interesting happens. Instead of getting growth and decay, we get these numbers here. If I expand them by repeated multiplication, I get the numbers will move around a circle. They create circular motion. They create oscillation. Okay? So what we have here now is we have these numbers corresponding to expansion and contraction, these numbers corresponding to rotation and oscillation. So sorry? Yeah, okay. Yeah, you got it. That's good. Okay, so these numbers here correspond to the oscillatory processes in creation. So what this is telling us now is that the processes of oscillation that generate frequency and the processes of expansion and contraction that create growth, they're complementary. They're two sides of the same coin. They represent two aspects of polarity, and the two polarities are integrated in the spiral. So the spiral combines the rotation and its associated oscillation from this direction with the expansion from this direction. So the spiral then represents the Partic-I synthesis that integrates these two fundamental processes in creation. Okay? So that indicates the power of the spiral. The spiral is this incredibly powerful structure, and it governs the processes of expansion and contraction in creation on the one hand, and it also, the spiral corresponds to the Partic-I, and the Particum, once it polarizes, it creates the process of expansion on the Particum side, and the process of oscillation, of rotation, and oscillation on the Partic-A side. So they just represent two polarities that emerge from this integrated unity. So the spiral has this very powerful property, and we can see it emerging. Like if we just look a little bit closely at the numbers, we can see we can see the whole pattern. Excuse me. We can see the whole pattern emerging. Now, I was going to say, oh yeah. So that's the significance of these numbers. That's why it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time coming to terms with them. That's why they're useful. When anybody is working with oscillations or vibrations in science, in engineering, whatever, they use these numbers quite a lot without knowing where they came from. Okay, so now we have a framework where we can bring it all together and we can see it in a much bigger picture with a much bigger perspective on the whole process. We can see all of this emerging from the very powerful structures that are present, more deeply rooted in creation. Okay, so we have the particle phasing then. Not only does it come through in, we'd say, the creation of particles and Vecchi universe and so on, it comes right through in the numbers. It's present, it's sitting right there in the numbers, and it has can reveal quite a lot of significance there. Now, just one other slightly sciencey thing before we go on. If we look at how systems behave, we can see again how these two processes are working at every level in physical manifestation, at every level in creation. So if we look at any system in creation, we can see how the energy comes in, energy is put in, energy is put into a system, we'd say in this direction. Now within the system, the energy is stored between two elements within the system. Now if we take a simple system like a weight on a spring, every system has an element of springiness, which is electrical in nature, and it has an element of weight or of mass, which is magnetic in nature. So when we put energy into a system, for example, when you pluck a guitar string, push a child on a swing, when a car hits a bump in the road, there's energy put into the system. The energy is held within the system between these two components, between the electrical and the magnetic components of the system. Now, these two components operate in opposition to each other, or they're polarized oppositely to each other. So the energy comes in, it's stored in the electrical component, or in the, we say in case of the spring, it's stored in the electrical component. Now, once the electrical component fills up with the energy, it starts giving it back out again. So it gives the energy back out, and as it's being given out by the electrical, it's being taken in by the magnetic. Because they're in opposition, as one is giving out, the other is drawing in. Once this gets saturated, once this fills up, it starts giving out, and by that point, the other polarity is taking the energy in. So what that does is it sets up the oscillation. So the energy is stored as an oscillation between these two components. So that when we would say have a weight in the spring, and if we pluck it, it will oscillate. The energy will move between the weight and the spring. It'll move between the electrical and the magnetic components, oscillate between the two, and in doing so set up a vibration, set up a frequency, set up an oscillation. Now, the frequency of the oscillation is determined by the balance between these two components. Now, if we take, we'd say a guitar as an example, we'd say when we pluck a guitar string, the tension of the guitar string would correspond to the springiness and to the electrical component, whereas the weight of the string would correspond to the magnetic component. So if I pluck a guitar string, it'll oscillate at a certain frequency. Now, as I put increasing tension in the guitar string, I'm increasing the electrical component, and the frequency goes up. So as I add tension to the string, the frequency goes up. And as I move to a heavier string, in other words, if I go to a heavier string on the guitar, the frequency goes down. So as I increase the electrical component, the frequency goes up. As I increase the magnetic component, the frequency goes down. So this balance between electric and magnetic influences determines frequency. And it sets up an oscillation. And this oscillation gives us frequency, and the frequency is determined by the balance between these two components. So just as we have, we say in a piano, we have a whole range of frequencies, and the frequencies are determined by the balance points between these two elements. Now finally, we'll say when I do plug a guitar string, I do get a sound at a certain frequency, but that sound dies away over time. So the energy in the string dissipates. It gets wasted. Now, in a proper crystic system, this energy would, instead of getting wasted, it would contract backwards into source. It would return to source, contract backwards through the center, and return to source. So we have problems whereby, in our universe at present, whereby the energy cannot go back to source properly, so it gets wasted. So we have a problem with energy dissipation. Now, so this is the diagram from the Guitar 1 manual and the Guitar 1 module presentation. So it illustrates the scale of frequency. In other words, the dimensional structure is dependent on frequency. It is different frequencies that determine the different dimensional scales within the dimensional structure and also within the higher cosmic structure that contains it. So as we increase the electrical component, the frequency goes up. As we increase the magnetic component, the frequency goes down. So the balance between electrical and magnetic elements is the key to frequency. Now, there's one other topic to touch on that is of major, excuse me, of major significance, and that is the speed of light, the significance of the speed of light. This has huge impact on the whole. It's a very important aspect in creation. It has a huge impact on the whole operation of Merkaba. Now, if we look at physical light in its ordinary physical light that we see with our eyes, that in fact is an electromagnetic phenomenon. It's an electromagnetic oscillation. It corresponds to an oscillation between electrical and magnetic component elements operating at a certain frequency. So ordinary physical light is electrical in nature. It's electrical and magnetic in nature, and it corresponds to an electromagnetic oscillation at a particular frequency. That's shown, here we have the full, an extended band of electromagnetic oscillations or electromagnetic vibrations. And we can see that the visible light corresponds to a particular part of that. Now, so the speed of light then is determined by electrical and magnetic properties of space. And there's a very specific relationship between them. The speed of light is determined by the electrical and the magnetic properties of space. Now, if we look at space and time, like they are extremely interesting topics in their own right. It's possible to trace both of them back right into the original particle structure that birthed creation, that birthed creation had its origins. For example, in the particle phasing process, where we have a more complete description of the particle phasing process, there is a description of voids. There's the emergence of voids in the early stages of the particle phasing process, and these voids are the origin of space. This is where space comes from. This is how space comes into being. So space can be traced right back into the particle phasing process, and from there it connects. The connection back to source can be traced. Sorry? Void, V-O-I-D. Okay, all right. Yeah. Okay, so we have space and time. Space, we tend to regard space as something rigid and static in the background. It's a stage in which all of creation happens. But it's not quite like that. Space is neither fixed nor rigid. Space is, in fact, something that's actually quite fluid. It can expand and contract, and it can flow and can be shaped. Now, there's a relationship here. It's a little bit complicated, but I'll go through it as best I can because it does bring us to a very significant point. Now, within our ordinary physical creation here, we have separation. For example, we have the separation between, let's say, a plane taking off from New York and the same plane landing in San Francisco. So between those two events, there is separation. There's an element of distance and an element of time involved in the separation of events. And there's a very specific relationship between those, between distance and time. And it's given by this relationship here. Now, if we look at this relationship from the perspective of source, source knows no separation. So from a source perspective, there is no separation. So separation is 0. So what we get then is that distance then is equal to the speed. C represents the speed of light. So the distance is equal to the distance squared is equal to the speed of light squared by time squared. So if I simplify that, I get the speed of light then is equal to distance over time. Now, again, from the source perspective, what that means is that the flow, if we look at this from the source perspective, we see distance as space expanding out from source. And this is occurring in time. And the proportion between them is given by the speed of light. The significance of the speed of light then is that it determines the flow of space through time. It effectively measures the rate of formation of space. The speed of light determines how space expands and also, we'll say, on the other side, how it contracts. So that's the significance of it. Now, up here we saw that the speed of light is determined by the electrical and the magnetic properties of space. Put these two together and we see how the electrical and the magnetic properties of space determine both space and time. So this means that electrical and magnetic properties influence the structure of space and time. So for example, by changing the magnetics, we can distort time, we can distort space, and so on. So what we have here is how it is possible to create these wormhole distortions, create these time distortions, these time loops, these toral rips, and so on. So this tells us how important the electrical and magnetic elements of creation are. They determine not only frequency, they determine the speed of light, and they determine the very nature, the very structure of space and time. So when we mess around, or when these are messed around with, they mess up the whole structure of space and time. And this gives us the clue as to how it is done, how these distortions have been done. So the electric and magnetic balance is of most fundamental importance because it determines the whole structure of everything in creation. Now, Ash has, in the Dance for Life material, Ash indicates that the speed of light is presently 3 times too slow because of excessive magnetic influence. Now, we get back to something a little bit more familiar. Now, the next stage we're going to look at is the whole process of Merkaba. One, if we think of the Metatronic Merkaba, like the Metatronic Merkaba has a relationship to the Metatronic spirals. In other words, the speed ratios have direct connection back to we'd say the Fibonacci spiral ratio. Now, we can look at the crystic Merkaba structures and their speed ratios to see there is a spiral structure present also, but it turns out to be quite an intricate structure, and we have to do a little bit of work to reveal that structure. But there is a structure there is a relationship between the Merkaba and spin speeds and spiral structure. And so that's what we're going to look at now. So just to recap, here we have a representation of Merkaba structure. Merkaba structure, very simply, is a process whereby energy is circulated into the structures of creation and that is cycled back out again. So we have an upper electrical Merkaba spiral that cycles energy from higher dimensional levels into the structures of creation. The structure, in this case, the structure of creation is represented by the guitar grid that carries its core encryption. So we have an electric spiral, an upper electrical spiral that circulates energy into the structure, that spins clockwise and circulates energy, electrical energy, into the structure. And it's balanced by a corresponding spiral of energy that's pointing downwards, that circulates magnetic energy, that spins counterclockwise and circulates magnetic energy, and effectively takes energy out of the structure, setting up a balanced inflow and outflow of energy from the particular structure. Now, the two spirals, these Merkaba spirals are three-dimensional in nature. They form what's referred to as a tetrahedron. The tetrahedron is like a three-sided pyramid where all the sides are equal. Now, these two tetrahedra, they interweave among each other, and they interact. And in the interaction, in the space in which they interact, when they interact, they create space. And this space forms an oval form, what is described as a form constant. And that is where the energy of the spirals is stored and becomes available to the structure or to do whatever is manifesting within the Merkaba. So this could be the Merkabic structure associated with our bodies on an individual level, with the planet at planetary level, solar system, or the galaxy at galactic and cosmic level. Now, we have our Merkaba spirals. We have for every upper electrical spiral, we have a corresponding lower magnetic spiral. The two, they come in pairs, and they have very close relationship to each other. So we have a pair of spirals, one for each dimensional level. The three-dimensional levels come together to form a density Merkaba set, and that structure continues. So we needn't spend too much time on, like there is a separate module. For people who are not completely familiar with Merkabic structure, there is a separate module which goes into it in much more detail. But we want to focus more specifically on the spin speeds, on the numbers behind the spin speeds. So we have, we'd say, the Merkaba spirals for dimensions 1, 2, and 3. When they come into relationship with the Merkaba spirals for dimensions 4, 5, and 6, they create a phase, what's referred to as a phase of Merkaba alignment. This is referred to, the first phase of alignment is referred to as the Hala phase. And we get this when the magnetic spiral is spinning counterclockwise at 11 2/3 spin speed. It corresponds to an extremely fast spin of some 11 2/3 rotations per trillionth of a nanosecond, I think it is. So, but the key point is the relationship between the electrical and the magnetic and the other components. So we have the magnetic spin speed of 11 2/3, the electric spin speed is 33 1/3. So we have a specific relationship between these spin speeds, and this is what we want to explore now. Now, the magnetic and the electric components, they represent polarities. They represent party common, party K polarities. And wherever we have polarities, we have the synthesis of the polarities, the party chi union of the polarities to form, in this case, we combine the magnetic and the electrical spin speeds to get the 45 spin speed that corresponds to the party chi, or the transharmonic representation of Merkaba. Now, at the core of the spirals, the spinning Merkaba spirals, we have a form constant which is generated by the difference between the spin speeds. The difference between the spin speeds is important. It sets up, it structures the form constant at the core, which holds the energy and holds a certain amount of the energy in balance in the core to make it available to whatever is living within that core, whether it's a body, a planet, or whatever. So these differential fields are important because they represent the energy that's held in balance at the core of the Merkaba spirals. Now, we have higher stages of Merkaba expansion, of Merkaba, we we phase up through the dimensional levels. The spin speed increases. It goes from 11 2/3, we say the magnetic component goes from 11 2/3 to 101 2/3 for the next phase of Merkaba alignment, which is referred to as the quadraphase. So at this stage, we get, instead of 11 2/3, we get 101 2/3 and 33 1/3. And at the next stage, above that again, we have 911 2/3 and 2733 1/3. All of these add up to whole numbers. Now, before we look at these Merkaba spin speed numbers, we just want to illustrate a few points. Now, number formation, how the numbers form. If we look at the root-shaped pattern, the root-shaped pattern illustrates the formation of number. So we have at the center of the root shape, we have the 6 and the 12 emerging. Then that polarizes and creates the 3 and the 9. This generates the 4 cardinal points on the clock. It generates the 4 quadrants of number. Now, each of these points further, these quadrant points further polarize, create an additional 8 octant points. And together they make up a set of 12 numbers. So this is how the we say the 12 emerges as as an important number in cosmic structure. Now, in addition to the 12 being an important number, 15 is also a very important number in crystallic structure. So, for example, where we have an enumeration of the numbers in creation, in, we'd say, the Messianic Aurora code, where we're given the original sound tones for the numbers. Where numbers are enumerated, we get 15. So we get 15 numbers enumerated in the Messianic Aurora code. Also, wherever we have, wherever elements are counted, we get 15. So, for example, if we have dimensions, we have 15 dimensions, we have 15 chakras, 15 levels in the Rasha bodies. So this number 15 is very important in the evolution of number. Now, if we take our original clock sequence that emerges from the Rouchet pattern, that gives us a 12-point clock, which is represented in the Illyrian chambers, the DNA imprint pattern, and so on. Now, where we have a 12-clock pattern, we generally also have an additional 12-clock pattern. So, for example, in the Vecchi universe structure, we have in every energy matrix, we have 2 Katara grids spanning the full width of the energy matrix. So we have, corresponding to the 12-point clock, we also have an additional 12-point clock that interlies between, so we have two 12-point clocks that come into alignment with each other to create a 24-point clock. And this 24-point clock corresponds to, we'd say, the 12 Illyrian chambers and the 12 fire chambers. Now, this creates a 24-way division of the circle, of the unity of the circle. And if we further divide each of these divisions by 15, we divide each of these divisions by 15. So we do that by multiplying each of the positions on the 24-point clock by 15. When we do that, we get the degrees of a circle. So we get 15, 30, 45 degrees, 90 degrees here at the quadrant point, and we get 360 degrees all the way around. So this gives us an idea of where this 360, how these numbers build up, how these build up to create structure, and where the 360 degrees comes from. Now, it's interesting to note that the 360-degree division of the circle, it approximates the number of days in a year. So we have roughly 360 days, 360 rotations of the Earth corresponding to one large rotation around the sun. So it isn't exactly the same, but the time sequence on the planet has been messed around with quite a bit. Now, one other point to note is that when we take two-dimensional structures and nest them one within the other, they scale by a factor of 2. So, for example, if we take a triangle, put a circle around it, and then take that pattern and insert it within the circle, the inner pattern is exactly half the outer one. So when we embed two-dimensional structures within each other, there's a scaling by a factor of 2. So if we take the full Merkaba star, the two-dimensional Merkaba star,